There is a particular silence that falls over a European traveler somewhere around the second week in America. Not boredom, not homesickness, but recalibration. The quiet, faintly embarrassed realization that assumptions carried across the Atlantic, shaped by decades of casual transatlantic condescension, were not incomplete. They were inverted. The country expected to be loud and unrefined kept revealing systems so quietly efficient that most Americans had stopped noticing them at all. What makes these discoveries strange is that none of them announce themselves. Nobody gasps at a parking lot or weeps at a warranty card. These are the unglamorous textures of ordinary life. A return desk, a thermostat, a walk-in closet. Too mundane for any travel brochure, too invisible to Americans to seem remarkable. And yet, in these corners, a visitor starts to feel the outline of something larger. Decisions made decades ago, in boardrooms and city councils, and post-war suburbs, that quietly rewrote what an entire population considers normal. This is a film about 6 of those decisions, and the moment, again and again, when a skeptical visitor stopped rolling their eyes and started asking why their own country never built it this way. Because the reaction was never really admiration. It was withdrawal, the private grief of coming home and finding home one size too small. What happens when a business simply believes you? For a European standing at a customer service counter in an American department store, holding a blender that has clearly been used, with no receipt and no box, the question is not rhetorical. It is a genuine test of disbelief. In most of Europe, a return without proof of purchase is treated as an anomaly requiring investigation, a manager summoned, a policy cited, a faint but unmistakable presumption that the customer is attempting something. In America, the same scene unfolds almost bureaucratically smooth. An employee scans a tag, asks nothing about intent, and hands back cash or store credit within 90 seconds. No interrogation, no suspicion, no story required. The instinct is to read this as carelessness, a company simply eating losses because it has more money than sense. That reading collapses quickly under its own logic, because no retailer survives a century by hemorrhaging cash to indifference. What is actually being witnessed is the tail end of a deliberate economic architecture, one built not around generosity, but around risk transfer, and it did not begin on a showroom floor. It began in the mail. In the final years of the 19th century, Sears, Roebuck and Company faced a problem no brick-and-mortar shop had ever needed to solve. How does a rural family in Nebraska trust a stranger in Chicago enough to send cash for a plow or a stove they will not see for weeks? The company's answer was radical for its time. An unconditional guarantee, refund without argument, the risk of a bad transaction absorbed entirely by the seller rather than the buyer. It was not altruism. It was the only mechanism capable of making distance commerce function at all. A skeptical customer base needed proof that the seller had more to lose from bad faith than the buyer did. That single structural choice outlived the catalog by more than a century. As American retail scaled into department stores, then big box chains, then e-commerce, the logic of the guarantee scaled with it, hardening into something closer to cultural expectation than corporate policy. Generous return policies became a competitive weapon between retailers rather than a courtesy extended to customers, each chain calibrating its leniency against the next. Because the moment one major retailer offered no questions returns, every competitor needed to match it or lose the anxious buyer to whoever removed the anxiety first. The result is a retail environment where trust is manufactured structurally, priced quietly into margins, rather than negotiated case by case at the counter. For a European accustomed to the opposite default, proof required, skepticism assumed, the American version registers first as suspiciously good, then as something closer to relief. Buying decisions that would ordinarily involve hesitation, comparison, second-guessing, become casual instead, almost weightless, because the cost of being wrong has been quietly absorbed by someone else. A visitor buys the wrong size, the wrong shade, the appliance that turned out to be unnecessary, and walks it back without composing a justification. It is only after returning to Europe that the absence becomes audible. A hesitation reappears at checkout that had not been there in months. A small mental tax reattaching itself to every purchase. The flicker of a question that says, is this worth the risk of being stuck with it? Nothing about the merchandise has changed. What has changed is the invisible economics of trust surrounding it. And once a person has lived inside a system engineered to remove that friction, its reappearance feels less like normalcy and more like a demotion.
If you did not know, in Germany, there's no AC at all. Like, air conditioning it's not a thing here at all. Like, AC in Germany stands for a crime. It doesn't stand for air conditioning, because having it is a crime here. Like, you'll go to hospitals and all the patients are on their last breath and they're like, because they literally are sitting in a hot oven all day. I have been living here for a little bit now, and I'm going to show you how people in Germany survive the summers without AC, because it may be kind of warm right now, but this is the coolest day you will ever feel, because global warming is a thing. The way we survive without AC in Germany is 1, be in denial. Hey Klaus, it's pretty hot in your house right now. No, it's not. It feels great. 2, everybody just doesn't wear anything when they go to bed. Everything is just hanging out. Hey Klaus, where are your clothes at? We were going to bed. Just close your eyes. It's very hot. So if you just close your eyes, you won't have to sit up this. And the last thing is, you just pray that it just gets cool at nighttime. Klaus, why are you opening up the window? It's still really hot outside. I could feel a breeze between my knees. So I think we could use that for the AC tonight.
A European renting a modest apartment outside Phoenix or Houston for the first time tends to notice the thermostat before almost anything else. Not because it is impressive, but because it is unremarkable. Mounted on the hallway wall of a building that would, by European standards, count as budget housing. There is no separate unit humming in a window, no accordion hose snaking out to a cracked open pane, no monthly negotiation over whether the heat is worth the expense. The air is simply cold, evenly in every room, all the time, and included. For a visitor used to treating climate control as a luxury reserved for hotels or the wealthy, the sheer ordinariness of it is what unsettles. The instinct is to assume this is simply a matter of national wealth, a richer country affording what a poorer one cannot. That explanation does not survive contact with the numbers, because the American households running central air and triple-digit heat are frequently not wealthy at all. They are working-class families in Texas trailer parks and Arizona apartment blocks, spaces that would be considered modest anywhere. The real explanation sits not in income, but in infrastructure, in a decision made industry-wide roughly 70 years ago that quietly rewired what American housing was allowed to be. Before the 1950s, American architecture in hot climates solved heat the way most of the world still does, passively. High ceilings pulled warm air upward and away from occupants. Deep porches and wide eaves threw shade across windows before the sun could reach them. Houses in the South were built narrow and breezy, oriented to catch prevailing wind, because there was no other option. Engineering the air itself was not yet possible at scale. Central air conditioning changed the entire premise of the problem. Once refrigerant-based cooling could be installed as standard building infrastructure rather than a specialty add-on, architects were freed from needing the house itself to manage heat, and the vernacular collapsed almost overnight. Ceilings dropped, porches shrank, windows sealed, because the building no longer needed to work with the climate when a compressor could simply overrule it. The consequence reached far beyond individual comfort. Entire regions of the country that had been marginal for large-scale settlement, the Sun Belt stretching from Florida through Texas into Arizona and Southern California, became viable for the kind of dense, year-round population growth that had previously been unthinkable in July. Phoenix was a modest desert outpost before mechanical cooling. It is now one of the largest cities in the country, an outcome inseparable from the compressor humming in every wall. Central air did not simply cool houses. It relocated millions of people, redrew the electoral map, and moved the center of gravity of an entire nation southward, one thermostat at a time. For the European visitor, none of this history is visible in the moment. What is visible is only the sensation, walking in from ferocious outdoor heat into a home that requires no adjustment, no fan pointed at a damp forehead, no strategic napping through the hottest hours of the afternoon, because the hottest hours simply do not register indoors. Life stops organizing itself around the sun. It is on the flight home, or more precisely, in the weeks after it, that the absence resurfaces. A European July arriving with its familiar closed shutters at midday, its fans pushing hot air in slow circles, its quiet cultural agreement that discomfort is simply the price of the season. None of it has changed. What has changed is the visitor, who now understands that this discomfort was never inevitable, only unbuilt. A problem that one country solved 70 years ago and never bothered mentioning, because to Americans, it had stopped looking like a solution at all. It just looked like Tuesday. Why does no one in America think about where the car will go? A European visiting a suburban American supermarket for the first time tends to notice the lot before the store. Not because it is beautiful, but because of its sheer disorienting scale. Rows upon rows of empty asphalt stretch out in every direction, more space devoted to stationary cars than to the building itself. And it is free, unattended, unlimited. There is no ticket machine, no barrier arm, no anxious circling for the one remaining space near an apartment building. A visitor accustomed to treating parking as a scarce, expensive, faintly stressful negotiation experiences something close to disorientation at its absence as a problem at all. The easy explanation is simply land. America is big, Europe is small. Of course, there is room to spare. That explanation feels satisfying until it is tested against the fact that plenty of American cities sit on land no more abundant than their European counterparts, and yet the parking ocean persists regardless, spreading across cities old and new, dense and sparse alike. The real cause is not geography. It is a single regulatory habit, adopted almost uniformly across the country starting in the 1950s, that continues to shape the built environment today: the parking minimum. Beginning in the post-war decades, American municipalities began writing zoning codes that did not merely permit parking, but legally required it, mandating a fixed number of spaces for every restaurant seat, every apartment unit, every square foot of retail floor, regardless of whether that many spaces would ever be used. A city planner working from projected car ownership rather than observed demand effectively wrote the automobile into the architectural DNA of the country before construction ever began. A restaurant could not simply build a dining room. It had to first satisfy an arithmetic formula dictating how much pavement must surround it. Over decades, this compounded into a landscape where the empty lot is not an accident of underuse, but a legal requirement, baked into the permitting process long before the first customer ever arrives. European cities, by contrast, were largely built and legally fixed in their footprints before mass car ownership existed at all. Medieval street grids, dense post-war reconstruction, historic districts protected from demolition, none of it designed around a vehicle that had not yet been invented when the streets were laid. Retrofitting parking into an already dense city is a fight against centuries of settled geometry, while an American suburb, built from scratch after 1950, could simply require the space from day one. The abundance a European encounters at the supermarket, then, is not a symptom of empty land. It is the fossil record of a regulatory choice, poured in asphalt and preserved for 70 years. For the visitor, the effect compounds quietly over weeks. Errands that would ordinarily require timing, strategy, spare change for a meter, become instantaneous instead. Pull in, park anywhere, walk in. The mental overhead of vehicle logistics, so constant in a European city that it barely registers as its own category of stress, simply disappears from the day. A visitor who arrived skeptical of car culture, expecting only sprawl and inconvenience, finds instead an ease of movement that reorganizes how much can be accomplished before lunch. It is back in Europe, circling a block for the third time in search of a legal space, that the absence becomes personal. The lot that once looked like wasteful excess now registers as something closer to generosity. An entire country having quietly decided decades ago that its citizens should never have to think about where the car goes. Nobody in America experiences this as a gift, because nobody in America remembers a version of the country where it was otherwise. The visitor remembers both versions now, and only one of them lets an errand stay an errand. A European unpacking a new set of cookware in an American kitchen or replacing the zipper pull on a well-worn suitcase tends to stumble across the same small piece of paper, a warranty card promising replacement not for a year, not for 5, but for life. Not the life of a warranty period, disguised in generous language, but the literal working life of the object, sometimes transferable, sometimes honored decades later, with nothing more than a phone call and a description of what broke. For a visitor used to warranties measured in months, and read with the assumption that the company is hoping you never test them, the American version reads first as a marketing gimmick. It rarely turns out to be one. The instinct is to assume this is simply generosity, a wealthy market indulging its customers. That explanation weakens quickly once the actual claims process is tested, because companies honoring lifetime warranties are not run by charities. They are run by people who have done the math and concluded that the guarantee costs less than the alternative. The real mechanism sits at the intersection of two forces that rarely get named together: an unusually aggressive American consumer protection tradition and a competitive branding strategy that turned durability itself into the product being sold. The legal foundation traces back to the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act of 1975, a federal law passed specifically to stop manufacturers from offering warranties so vague or conditional that they were functionally meaningless. The law did not require companies to offer lifetime coverage, but it did require that any warranty offered be written in plain language and be honored as stated, stripping away the fine print escape hatches that had let companies advertise generosity while quietly avoiding it. Once vague warranties became a liability rather than a marketing convenience, companies faced a choice: write something narrow and unimpressive, or commit to something bold and build a reputation on actually keeping it. A handful of manufacturers chose bold, and it became a competitive weapon in its own right. A company willing to replace a product forever is making an implicit claim about how rarely that replacement will actually be needed. The warranty functions less as a safety net and more as a public bet on the company's own engineering, a bet visible to every customer standing in the aisle. Once one major brand in a category adopted this strategy and survived it profitably, competitors faced pressure to match it or concede the durability argument entirely, and lifetime warranties spread across categories: cookware, luggage, tools, outdoor gear, not because customers demanded it loudly, but because manufacturers realized that confidence itself had become the differentiator worth advertising. For a European accustomed to replacing a broken zipper or a warped pan out of pocket, filing it under the unremarkable cost of owning things, the experience of a genuine no-cost replacement changes the emotional relationship to the object itself. A suitcase stops being a disposable purchase amortized against an expected lifespan and becomes something closer to a standing agreement, a company's ongoing obligation rather than a one-time transaction concluded at checkout. The purchase decision quietly expands its own timeline, because the real question stops being how long will this last and becomes how long will this company be around to make it right. It is back in Europe, standing over a broken kettle with a receipt long since lost, that the absence resurfaces. Not dramatically, just as a small, specific frustration. The object is dead, and there is no one to call. Nothing was owed, nothing was promised, and the visitor is reminded that this was, in fact, always the norm almost everywhere else. What lingers is not resentment, but a kind of quiet recalibration, the memory of a country where breaking something did not have to mean losing it. A European staying in a mid-range suburban American home for the first time, the kind of house that would be described locally as comfortable rather than luxurious, tends to open what looks like a second bedroom door and find, instead, a small windowless chamber lined with shelving and a rod for hanging clothes. A walk-in closet, standard, unremarkable, included in a house that by no measure counts as extravagant. For a visitor used to a wardrobe cabinet pressed against a bedroom wall, the sheer existence of an entire dedicated room for storing clothing registers less as luxury and more as a kind of spatial disbelief. Nobody in the house treats it as special. It is simply where the clothes go. The easy explanation is wealth. Americans are richer, so American houses are bigger, so of course there is room to spare for closets. That explanation buckles quickly against the income data because the households living in these houses are frequently solidly middle class, carrying mortgages calibrated to ordinary salaries, not fortunes. The real explanation lives in two structural forces that rarely get discussed as related: how Americans finance a home and how much land that home is legally permitted to sit on. The American mortgage market is built almost entirely around a financial instrument that barely exists elsewhere in its current form: the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage, standardized and backed by government-sponsored entities that buy loans from banks and guarantee them, spreading risk across the entire financial system rather than concentrating it in any single lender. This single mechanism does something quietly enormous. It locks a monthly payment in place for 3 decades, immune to the interest rate swings that in most countries force homeowners into shorter terms, variable rates, or smaller loans calibrated to nervous lenders. A stable, predictable, multi-decade payment lets an ordinary family finance a larger structure than an equivalent income could support almost anywhere else, because the lender's risk horizon and the buyer's risk horizon are both, unusually, working in the same direction. That financial capacity meets a second force at the local level: zoning. Post-war American suburbs were platted on residential lots, dramatically larger than their European equivalents, a product of abundant undeveloped land and municipal codes that, unlike dense European cities constrained by medieval footprints and strict historic preservation, impose few limits on how far a house could sprawl outward or how large a parcel a builder could claim. Where a European developer works within centuries of settled density, an American developer working in a 1970s subdivision faced comparatively few constraints beyond the property line itself. Cheap financing met abundant permitted land, and the byproduct was square footage with nowhere obvious to go. Extra space that eventually stopped being used for anything functional and started being used simply for containment. The walk-in closet is not an amenity that was designed. It is surplus square footage that acquired a name. For the European visitor, the room registers first as absurd, then, within days, as something closer to organizational clarity. Clothes stop competing for space with the bedroom itself. What was once a cramped daily negotiation between a wardrobe door and a bed frame becomes instead a small, dedicated ritual. Walking into a space built for exactly one purpose: seeing everything at once, closing the door on the mess entirely. The bedroom, freed of its storage function, starts to feel like a bedroom again. It is back in Europe, wedging a folded sweater into an overstuffed cabinet balanced against a bedroom wall, that the absence becomes physical rather than abstract. The visitor is not missing luxury. They are missing a decision made decades earlier, in mortgage law and municipal zoning offices, about how much room an ordinary life was entitled to take up. A decision that quietly built itself into the walls of an American bedroom and never once had to be seen for what it was. A European traveler discovering a fraudulent charge on an American credit card statement, some unfamiliar purchase made 3 states away or 3 time zones away, tends to brace for the ordeal that would follow at home. The police report, the bank dispute form, the weeks of uncertain limbo waiting to learn whether the money is actually coming back. What follows instead is almost anticlimactic. A phone call, a few identifying questions, and the charge is reversed, often before the statement has even finished printing. No proof of innocence is demanded beyond a denial. The cardholder is not treated as a suspect in their own theft. They are simply believed. The instinct is to assume this is simply how credit cards work everywhere. Plastic is plastic, fraud is fraud. That assumption collapses quickly for anyone who has disputed a debit charge in most of Europe, where the burden of proof sits far more heavily on the account holder and the timeline for resolution can stretch into months. The American version is not a universal feature of card payments. It is the product of a specific legal floor, raised considerably higher by a specific competitive war. The floor was built in 1974 when Congress passed the Fair Credit Billing Act, a law drafted to address a much narrower problem than fraud protection: inaccurate billing statements, but which contained a provision capping a cardholder's liability for unauthorized charges at $50. It was a modest consumer protection, not a headline law, and for years it functioned exactly as narrowly as written. Cardholders were protected from catastrophic loss. But $50 was still $50. Still, a real number a victim was expected to absorb. What turned a modest legal floor into an aggressive marketing promise was not further legislation. It was Visa and MasterCard fighting each other for the same customers. In the late 1990s, as online shopping began accelerating and fear of entering a card number into an unfamiliar website became a real barrier to spending, both networks independently rolled out zero liability policies, eliminating even that $50 exposure entirely. Neither company was legally required to do this. Both did it because the other was about to, and because a card holder choosing between two otherwise similar cards would predictably choose the one that promised to absorb all the risk rather than most of it. Fraud protection stopped being a legal minimum and became a competitive product feature, marketed directly to a public that had never asked for it in writing, but responded to it immediately in behavior. The effect compounded as e-commerce grew. A population that trusted its cards to shield it completely from fraud spent more freely online than a population still calculating its own exposure with every transaction, and that freedom fed back into the broader economy, into cardholders essentially externalizing fraud risk onto an infrastructure of banks and card networks built specifically to absorb it, invisibly, as the cost of moving spending itself upward. For a European visitor, the psychological shift arrives quietly, usually after the first fraud incident rather than before it. The moment a theft that should have produced dread instead produces mild inconvenience, resolved by dinner. Card use stops carrying the low hum of risk calculation that debit spending carries almost everywhere else. The reflexive mental note of this is real money leaving a real account. Spending starts to feel less like handling currency and more like handling a claim on an institution that has already agreed to absorb the mistake. It is back in Europe, staring at a debit card and calculating exactly how much is actually in the account before a purchase, that the absence becomes tangible again. The return of a small, specific vigilance that had quietly disappeared for months without ever being noticed leaving. Nothing about the card has changed. What has changed is the visitor, who now understands that the sense of safety was never inherent to plastic itself. It was underwritten, deliberately, by a company that once needed a reason for a stranger to trust it enough to spend. None of these 5 rooms, systems, or policies were designed to be admired. No architect drew a walk-in closet to inspire envy. No zoning board wrote a parking minimum hoping a foreigner would one day find it moving. Each was a narrow, practical answer to a narrow, practical problem. How to sell by mail, how to survive July, how to store a car, how to store a coat. Solved decades ago by people who could not have imagined anyone crossing an ocean to notice. And that may be the actual pattern beneath all 5. The things that most reliably move a visitor are never the ones built for spectacle. The monument gets photographed and then forgotten by dinner. The thermostat gets lived in day after day until it quietly becomes the baseline against which everything else is measured, and only reveals itself as remarkable once it is gone. Pride, it turns out, is not what a country says about itself. It is what a country stops noticing about itself, because it has simply always been there, which leaves the visitor with an odd kind of homework, carried home in the luggage along with everything else. Not a verdict about which country is better. That question dissolves under any real scrutiny, but a quieter one, harder to put down. How many of these decisions, sitting invisibly inside their own country, has no one ever thought to question, simply because no one has ever been anywhere else to notice they were a choice at all?